Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So I am here again with my friend Herb Butterworth, all the way from up yonder in Maine, and we are going to talk about some of the things that we've gone over in this video series that we've discussed regarding creation and evolution, some of the issues, just kind of conclude on the series. And with that, I think that um, we should probably jump right into it. So, Herb, uh, we were talking about um, obviously in the series the contrast between uh, what two opposing worldviews, right? You got creation, God created everything, complete, and then reproducing after its own kind. The evolutionist view would be um, something that is more along the lines of unsurety as to how things actually started and got here, but pretty sure about how things transition and change one thing to another. Though, as we talked, there's really no evidence to that. It's an expectation that they hope to one day reach. That though the evidence isn't there currently, they will find it one day. So. Um, Why don't we start with where things begin in origins? How's that sound?
Sounds fine. Well, I guess we could talk, origins. How did everything get started? Why do we have something rather than nothing? Um, it's quite a question. It's something that I think everybody has pondered, or at least should ponder at some time. Why do we have something rather than nothing? And what is the best explanation for that? Now, the naturalists will say, well, science can explain all of that. We may not, as you pointed out, we may not have the answers right now, but we will in time. But there's some tremendous difficulties with that. How does something exist without a cause? In other words, how can something be eternal with no explanation? Well, we as creationists we say, well, something exists outside of time and space. I don't think there's any way to get around that. And our something is God, and He is an intelligent being, a necessity with infinite power, infinite wisdom. And He called all of these things to be. He called the universe into existence. He created life in the universe, and He gave all the structure that we see today. Um, you can go down a real rabbit hole in the naturalist explanation of something for nothing. And I've done I haven't really taken a look at that recently, but I know in times past I was really taking a deep dive into that and how they explain this, and it just comes up so empty. And I'll tell you, I think you probably looked at this a little bit too, Scott, the something from nothing thing, and they talk about the violation of the conservation of energy. Well, that's quite a big thing, and that's never been shown to be a possibility, but they insist on it. And their view of nothing is that there is a constant state of virtual particles. I would say that they explain this in the fact that you would have virtual quarks, say, popping in and out of existence continually, and that's their view of nothing. So you have a quark and an anti-quark constantly in their nothing field. These are constantly being produced and annihilated, one being positive, one being negative, and together they would annihilate each other. But you're still left with the question, well, how did that come to be? How are these quarks or virtual quarks popping in and out of existence? That's something. That's not nothing, and it must have an explanation. There must be a cause to that, but that they just tend to not pay attention to that, or that's good enough for them. But it really isn't. Are these things? Our question would be: are they existing in time? So is time infinite? Obviously, if these things exist, they have to exist in time. Um, and again, I'll go back to the cause of this. Why would that possibly be? And they talk about the violations of the conservation of energy, because if you have something pop into existence from nothing, well, there was no energy there to begin with, but all of a sudden this is there, and they say that's okay as long as it's done quickly enough. Well, what kind of an explanation is that? And I guess the argument from their point of view would be this: they would say that in our minds, that zero represents nothing, no thing, nothing there. But they're saying, and I'm sure that there would be some that would argue this point with me, but I really think this is what they're saying, is that, okay, you have zero, we have one minus one equals zero. Isn't that saying the same thing? That would be their argument. I would say, no, it's not the same thing. You have something and then something else taken away from that that equals zero. We're just saying zero. There was nothing. That's what we're talking about. And that's what we have to get to. They can't do that. So, with this in mind, the most logical explanation would be that something exists outside of time and space before there was time or space or matter or energy. Nothing was there. Something had to exist outside of that. And it had to have been something immensely powerful, more powerful than we can even imagine in our finite minds. And it had to be something of intelligence, because when we look into the universe as it is today, it's incredibly well organized and just finely tuned for all that's in it. And that would be something hard to get away from. And it is hard for them to get away from. And in fact, they can't get away from it. And how they going into these rabbit holes with them, and looking into this something from nothing phenomena. um you go into the physics of it, and they talk about like Planck time, and the brief time before the Big Bang, and physics breaks down at that point, and they admit that they don't have an understanding of that, yet they insist that there is a rational explanation behind it, yet they don't have it, but they believe that in time that they'll come up with it. And I just think it's absolute nonsense. And that's just the beginning, just getting things kicked off. And so with that in mind, I think the creationist argument, and saying that there has to be an intelligence outside of time and space that created all of this, I think that is absolutely the most rational conclusion to come to. And then of course we can move on from there, and then everything came to be, and then stars came to be, and we can talk about that a little bit, about how stars came to be, and these enormous hydrogen clouds that are forming hundreds of thousands of years after the Big Bang. Things cooled enough that particles could start to form. And then we have these massive hydrogen clouds and dust, and they form stars. And how do they form stars? There had to be something, some force in the universe that would drive them together, because before you reach critical mass with these hydrogen clouds, there has to be enough condensation, so to speak, that gravity would start to work, and it would pull on their hydrogen molecules in. But before that, they're actually repulsive towards one another. So they would explain this, and one of the explanations is that a supernova, the shock from a supernova, forced them together to reach that critical mass where all of a sudden it could start to form. And once you got enough hydrogen into the cloud, then they would ignite through gravity. And then you have your fusion process taking place, and there you have your star of today. Where did the supernova come from? Because we don't have any stars formed yet. And they just kind of leave you hanging there. I don't
Well, I
know.
think that, I mean, it sounds like obviously, um, and I'm not saying this to be unkind, but obviously the reality is that they obviously play to people's ignorance. I think a lot of times, and look, I'm not a scientist. I've heard things in the past that atheists and evolutionists have said that I had to look into because, you'd hear something and you'd go, I don't really understand exactly what they're saying, but that doesn't sound quite right. And so you look into it and then you realize, well, that doesn't even make any sense. And I think that in talking about the origin of the universe, which I don't think that you can avoid it. In other words, if you're a biologist and an evolutionist and you say, well, hey, I'm just concerned about what I see and how it grows and, um, micro to macro evolution in a sense, or modifications to change in species. Um, I don't have to worry about the origin of the universe. I beg to differ. I think that um, you can't, if you can't connect your current observational science to origins science, in other words, where things started, if you have no explanation um, for how things happened, then I think that you lack the perspective and the knowledge when dealing with it to be able to um, have an accurate um, or a more accurate understanding of what you're actually studying. For example, um, the reason that um, uh, people are good mechanics are not just because they figured out how an engine works. It's because they understand the purpose of the engine, and you understand the purpose because you understand that originally when they made it. I mean, in other words, you can not really know anything about Henry Ford or you know um, any of the kind of the historical details of car engines and everything. If you just want to change spark plugs, right? You unscrew the spark plug, you follow the manual to put another one in, connect it back up, and you're done and off. But if you actually want to learn and dig into um, engines, then the better mechanics, the ones that actually know what they're talking about, they understand a bit of the history, like what engines were designed for initially, because there's an aspect to when you're designing the cylinders and the compression ratio, and I mean the reason that the old hot rods sounded the way they did because the cams were oversized because they pushed the cylinder heads up higher and brought them down lower, and do you know what I mean? Um,
Hmm.
so, but one, in other words, when you actually understand the intention behind the creation of the engine, you can bring it further and understand it better because you're not just looking at the mechanics of how it works, you're understanding the purpose to which it was created in the first place, and then why it was developed the way it was because of what you're trying to do with it. And I think, when you look at a lot of the creation scientists, they're much more insightful. I think it's just ignorance that claims that somehow creationism is anti-scientific or against science or rejects science. That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard because it's actually creation scientists that are taking real data into account, and they're not only connecting it with the observational things that they see now, but they also work it back to the origins of where things came from and why they exist in the first place. I think that's what historically, Newton and all those guys that were Christians, um, they pursued. um, their scientific endeavors because they realized God made things in an ordered way, and there was something that they could discover and figure out through it. So it actually fueled their move forward. If there's anything today, and again, we've had the people that put the comments and the posts on these videos, and they say, you guys are stupid. You don't know what you're talking about. Evolution is just, it's a fact. Face it. To deny it, you don't know what science is, and all this other. That's all nonsense because the reality of it is that the advancements in science and the foundation laid for science today was laid by people that believed in God, that did science, because they had to understand that science was doable. If evolution were actually true and if God didn't exist, there'd be no order. Like what would be the purpose of doing science? You could put all this effort into researching, something that's really not goal directed, not organized, and could change at any minute to something else. So what's the sense? Like why would you even do that? But they do that because
I think those, yeah,
they live in a theistic universe and
absolutely,
they know
Scott.
that. What's that?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. That's so true. I think Oppenheimer, the great scientist, physicist, he uh, he was very clear about what he said. When talking about science, and he said to do science properly, you have to be open to all things. There are no suggestions that can be off the table. Nothing can be off the table, and all thoughts, no matter how ridiculous they may appear to somebody working on a specific thing, you cannot reject them outright. You have to look into them. And there's no question that the evolutionist does that. What we're presenting is not a rejection of science, but a rejection, in our opinion, um, of their conclusions to science, and we're suggesting another way, which to me is far more practical than what they're suggesting, and they are just flat out rejecting it. I don't. I reject it after looking into it. I mean, I look at everything that they say. I read all the information that I can, and I make my conclusion based on that. They don't even bother to look into it. If you mention a creator, if you mention God, they reject it right off the bat. And there's no question about that. And if they're honest about it, they do. They don't really look into it. Much like many people reject the Bible as just a silly ancient book of fairy tales. Those people that say that, they have not studied it. They have not, they've hardly looked at it, if they've looked at it at all. And I think a good analogy, you were talking about an understanding of something rather than an explanation of something. And I think this would be a good analogy. You walk into a room and there's a chocolate cake on the table, and one person says, "Oh, well, obviously a baker made that chocolate cake," and somebody else says, "Oh, that's not necessarily so." And they analyze it and they find out what's in it, and they find that there's flour, there's eggs, there's baking soda, there's chocolate or cocoa powder, and they say, see, we know everything that goes into this cake. There's no necessity for a baker to be involved here. This is just stuff that put together, and now we have this chocolate cake before us. And the guy that says, well, that doesn't mean that a baker didn't have to put it all together. And I think, as ridiculous as that sounds, I think that's the argument that they're making. They can
No,
explain it. They know what's in
no,
it.
I think that's a great analogy. As a matter of fact, it's a perfect analogy because um, they can look at the ingredients, you know,
Yeah,
and because they know the ingredients, somehow they think that uh, its origin is insignificant.
yeah. Yeah, it just all came together, and somebody left the window open, and a big wind came through, and blew flour and eggs and baking powder, and everything just kind of came together. And then it went into a bowl and somehow got into the oven, and heat was applied, and there you have it.
Well, if you give it enough
That's
time, anything can happen, Herb.
yeah. Well, we can go. We can get into the origins of life, and talk about
Well,
that. And
before we jump into that, um, you know, talking about the cake, I think that the reason that it's important that you recognize the baker is because you may have to ask the baker exactly how they mixed it if you like the cake,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
what they're saying is because I know what the ingredients are, I don't need the baker. But the cake wouldn't be there without the baker. So they
right.
may be able to analyze the ingredients, and that's what they basically do. They look at molecules, they look at biology, and they do. They analyze the ingredients. And then they say, well, if you think that you needed a baker, well, that, you're dealing with religion. I mean, that's got nothing to do with the analysis of the ingredients. And in one sense, I understand what they're saying. If you want to analyze the ingredients, then you don't need to have the baker over your shoulder. However, if you really want to understand why the ingredients are there, how the ingredients were used and put together properly to come out with that cake, well, you're going to need the baker because you may not be able to figure it out all on your own. And what they're saying is once you bring God into the mix, because you can't stick him under a microscope, though you can't stick logic under a microscope, you can't stick philosophy, you can't stick your conscience, you can't even stick your thinking method under a microscope. All those things required to do science, though you can't put God under a microscope, they're saying that he's not relevant to science. And if let's just say it like this: if God actually exists, which really would be necessary in order for us to be here, if God exists and you ignore his existence, then you're actually cutting a major part of reality off. I just got through talking to one of the high school classes, and you know, I said there's so many people, and we're going through the Old Testament and the New Testament, but I said there's so many people that are just living their life, and they are they are trying to find some means of discovering their significance or why life is meaningful or how we got here, why we're here. They're wondering about all these things. I mean, the answer is there obviously in the scriptures, and the Bible tells us that. But but because they can't figure it out, they're frustrated. They don't really know the purpose of life. I mean, imagine if you got into a football game and you didn't know the rules, like you didn't know the purpose of the game. We just had the Super Bowl, right? So imagine if you didn't know the purpose of the game, you weren't sure about what scoring or in or out of bounds is about. You know how frustrating it would be playing that game if you didn't have those answers ahead of time? You'd be saying, like, you'd step out of bounds and they'd say out of bounds, and you go, well, you'd be all frustrated. It's like, well, but I didn't know that, or why should that be out of bounds? Like, in other words, it's a constant frustration because you're playing the game, but you're really not sure what the whole purpose of the game is, so you're not really sure how to play it right. And you could be sitting over on the side of the field, not even, being one of the 11, not even being part of the play because you don't know that you're supposed to be part of the play. Do you know what I mean? So everything is
Yeah,
all a measure of frustration. And people are going through life like that. They're saying, like, why am I here? I don't understand. Or they get caught up in these stupid things. They're on the third, fourth, fifth, sixth marriage. In other words, they can't figure out what life is about. And then somebody comes along and says, well, life is meaningless. There's no purpose for life. It's just pitiless indifference. We're just kind of marking our time and until we end up just being part of the dirt from which we came, and that's just it. And it's like, so there's no purpose, there's nothing. And then they wonder why people do the crazy things they do, or they come up with the ridiculous ideas, and they waste their time. And what I said to these kids, I said, look, I said, you guys get your whole life ahead of you, in a sense. You teenagers, um, you're all gonna get into whatever careers and everything you're gonna do. I said, but then, if you last long enough, you'll get to where I am, and you'll be an old guy on Medicare. And you'll look back having many more years behind you than ahead. And I said, you're going to come to the place where I'm at, and you're going to realize I either ordered my life according to what was real and true, or I wasted my time, which meant I just spun my wheels to either accumulate a massive amount of money so I could just buy a whole bunch of stuff and do things with it, or I gained a position of power so I could control things, or I get into politics, or I get into the medical field because I felt like I wanted to help people. But in other words, but if you ignore the reality of God and the whole purpose of life for which we're created, you can very quickly get to the end of your life and realize I wasted my life, you know? And even as a Christian, there's so many Christians that are, they have really missed the whole purpose of why they're here. They get off on kind of crazy tangents and everything else. And, you know, look, if I could go back, even as a Christian, and um, remake some decisions, there's some decisions along the way I may say, well, you know what, going down that road with what I know now, it'll just kind of be a little bit of a waste of time and some frustration, so I wouldn't do it. But I like when I worked for IBM, I get saved in '82. I started working for IBM in '81, and I worked for them up until 1993. And I worked with guys that had more um, technological education than I did. I also worked with guys that were um, schooled in business and everything else. IBM always hired the cream of the crop. And these guys are all good at what they did, but you know what? Um, they weren't good at life. Like they didn't know what what it even meant. Some of them were heart attack after heart attack. Some of them died right after they retired. Um, Other of them, they couldn't keep marriage or family together. Hey Herb, did I lose you?
Hold on a second.
Lost the picture.
Yeah, I got a telemarketer. There we go.
Oh, all right. But
Yeah.
anyway, you know what I'm saying? In other words, you can just waste time. And what's happening here is we're trying to we're doing these videos and trying to explain the value of understanding that there's a creator so that your life can be ordered um, in such a way not only to know him but to be really directed towards what is the reality of our purpose for existence. And let's face it, being on the other side of the tracks now, because I came from the wrong side in a sense. Um, I mean, if living like a non-Christian was so great and wonderful, I'd go back. I've never had more fun, more laugh, more peace, more joy. I've never had. I mean, I love being a Christian. For 40, what, 40. Uh, See, it's 2025 and 82. So what's that? 43 years. It's been great.
Yeah, I think what you say about a non-Christian or non-believer in their lives. and how they go about things. And I guess if you live as a non-believer, there's really no purpose to anything. You're just out there to gain as much as you can for yourself and your family. I'm not saying you're totally selfish, and you can have some good times, and but there's no purpose to anything. Every day is in and of itself just living for that day and trying to make the most of it. But there's really, and it's hard for me to really explain or describe it, but you're just living the day, and nothing has any real value. And that's how they go through their lives. And it's so difficult to speak to somebody who lives in that way and try to explain to them the difference in living as a Christian. And I think that they have this fear of becoming a Christian, and it's like a life of self-deprivation, which it absolutely is not. And they can't see that. They can't see the value in it, the joy in it that that gives your life meaning and purpose. And as you were describing, you say that since you become a Christian, you've had just so much of a better life, and the experiences that you've had, the people that you've met, the people that you're around as a Christian, and it's just that it's totally different. And having been, I was never a non-believer, but I didn't live the Christian lifestyle, and before that, and I'm not going to say I didn't have some good times. I did have some good times, but there was no value in it. It was just all for me, and I think Christianity changes that, and I think it's hard until you discover that on your own. I don't think that somebody can really explain that to you, and for some reason, there's something in a lot of people that they just refuse to acknowledge that. They can be confronted with it, they can see it. They even, I think, internally, they know that it's true, but they just won't have it. They don't want anything to do with it for whatever reason. And I don't think that they have an understanding of what they are depriving themselves of. And it's really sad. And I think you're talking about, the purpose of these videos. The purpose of these videos is to ultimately try to reach these people and explain to them what this is all about, what Christianity is all about, and ultimately that they have a God that loves them, that created them to have fellowship with them, and wants nothing more than that from them. And they're cutting him off as much as he wants them. They cut him off, and I think this is expressed in what we're seeing in the sciences today, and the rejection of of a creator when it's so blatantly obvious that we have one. As we talked about origins of the universe. I mean, come on. Look at some of the ways that they try to explain this. I talked about the virtual particles popping in and out of existence, and we call that nothing. And they're supposed to be on a higher level of thinking, and for us to not accept that or to question that means that we're the ones that don't get it. That
No, I know
it's very it's
it's
frustrating.
well because it's folly, and like Lennox said, right? If you know, uh, foolish statements made by world famous scientists are still foolish statements, and if you're talking nonsense, it's still nonsense. I mean, look, you can be Lawrence Krauss and write a book on the universe from nothing, but the reality is that he needed something to make it from. And
Yeah,
you can call again, you can see this is the problem. You can define things however you want. It can be nothing, or it can be something. You can call something nothing. I mean, you know, this is the whole problem. In other words, people, in a sense, have lost their minds when it comes to defining aspects of reality which are obvious. I mean, we're you were talking about it before, when we were having a different conversation, and you said, we've come to the place where men can think they're women and women can think they're men. I mean, this is an absurdity. I mean, it it doesn't matter um, how you try to define it. You cannot change the biology of people. It is what it is. You can't alter their chromosomes, right? They are what they are. Um, and and it, throughout all history of science and the world as we've known it, we've always known that there's only male and female. And the fact that somebody that's a male can look at a female physically, they are a biological female, and say, that's what I think I am, should tell them right away that they're not, because they're looking at somebody that is physiologically, biologically different than them. And so, if that's the case, then that's not what they are. In other words, you can't, that's like saying, I see that color, that's green. And um, so I'm going to think this is green, but it's not green, it's black. Okay. So the only reason I know that's green is because I've identified it as green. I know what green is. N- But I also know that this isn't that. Do you know what I mean? And
Well,
so,
it's interesting. This all ties in that way of thinking, and this is important for people to understand this. When we look at these things, we look at, we were talking about the origin of the universe here, and we'll just look at that for a minute. Now, all these explanations, we say, obviously, there's a creator outside of time and space, and this creator is intelligent, and he had purpose. And they come up with these things. I was talking about virtual particles, and that's nothing. And then somebody else says, "Whoa, oh, the universe is cyclic. It goes on through eternity, and the Big Bang happens. It expands. It cools. It goes into nothing. It's swallowed. All the material in it is swallowed up by black holes, and it goes back to nothing again. And then we have another explosion, and the whole thing. It's just cyclic, and that's been going on." Or somebody else has a brilliant idea that says, well, there's a multiverse. There's many universes out there, and that explains for the fine tuning, because there's so many, there's trillions of universes, perhaps more. Obviously, one of them is going to have these settings just so that life can evolve in it. And we go on, and people are accepting that. But that's just, it tells you right there when you start seeing these things, every one of them having their own problem, ultimately the same thing. We're looking at a cause. What caused all this? We can't do that. But they're just, it's like just smoke screens everywhere, smoke screens. Now we go into look at that same mindset, and we have multi genders. Everybody everybody, no matter what they say, knows that there are two genders, and they know that men are men and women are women. And just because you put a wig on and a pearl necklace, you can't be a woman just because of that. You know, no more than I can take. We have deer out in the backyard here. I can't strap antlers onto a doe and say that's a buck. It's not. It's a doe with fake antlers on. That's all it is. It's either a doe or a buck, and you can't change from one to the other. And people buy into that, or at least they pretend to buy into that, and they know perfectly well. They know that there are two genders, and that's it. You're one or the other. There's nothing you can do about it. It's how you were born. That's it. Face it. There was a creator to the universe. Face it. Everybody knows that. Everybody. Deep down inside, they know it. Now we can come to evolution. Evolution does not work. It just flat out doesn't work. You can come up with all these explanations and theories and say this is happening, that's happening. It doesn't work. It's just a ridiculous notion. I mean, your favorite thing, you look at DNA and the kinesin. For people that don't understand what the kinesin is, I very strongly recommend you go look into that. Just Google it, the kinesin in DNA. It is mind blowing. And to say that this came from a random, purposeless function of evolution. You've to believe that, you've got to be out of your mind. That is just absolute insanity. And to point at a Christian and say, "Oh, you and your God of the gaps, trying to fabricate this God out of nowhere. The Keneson is a random, mindless, purposeless thing, and that's the truth." Come on, people. Come on. You have a creator. The creator loves you. He wants you to be there with him throughout eternity. Just yield to it. And you don't know how good this is. It's the best decision you can ever make in your life, and your life will be so much better for having done that. And I'm just pleading with you to please don't go down this road. All of these things that we talked about, to counter that is nonsense. It's folly, and everybody knows it within them. They know all these things to be true. They know that there's a creator, and they know that we have purpose in this life. It may not be what you think you want right now, but it is. And you cannot go wrong. But you can go wrong by rejecting him and living a life of misery apart from him. And that's all I can do. You know,
Well,
what can I say?
when I it's interesting. I think it boils down to certain things, but when I left IBM in '93, I was on a project over at Northeastern University. We were putting the all 40 buildings they had at the time on campus, connecting them, putting, routers, switches, building a network in each of them and everything. So the project was still going. I was the project manager when I left. And so the university actually hired me because the Division of Academic Computing, at the Division of Academic Computing, the director didn't want to direct it. So I said, okay, sure. I took that job and essentially for about 3 years um, oversaw academic computing for him. Good job, great gig, right? Um, and so it was interesting because one of the guys that was there, and some of them, I mean, this is a university environment, and a lot of smart people there, a lot of smart people working in academic computing, and they all had more degrees than I did, and so I was just looked at as though I knew the network and everything, and could actually um, help them develop kind of a service organization for the campus. It was interesting because I would share Christ with them. And one of the guys looked at me one day and he got it. He said, Scott, he said, there is no way that I would put my life under the control and submit my own um, the rule of my own life to somebody else. I said, that's exactly what Christianity is. He goes, yeah, I would never do that. He said, I would never relinquish the sovereignty of my own life to somebody else. He said, I don't care who it is. But he got it. He understood. I mean, it was sad that he wouldn't do that, but he understood that being a Christian, um, you know, that really was where it was going, that I would put my life under the rule of Jesus Christ as opposed to myself. In other words, God would become God and I wasn't anymore. He
Well,
just didn't
listen,
want to give up being God of his own life,
yeah.
which is
Well,
fine,
that's a
but that's
foolish
the issue.
decision. Yeah. If I'm in a 747 and I'm flying from coast to coast, I'm going to be back in the passenger seat that I've been assigned. I'm going to stay there. I'm not going to go up to the cockpit and tell the pilot, hey, I don't trust you flying this plane. Even though I've never flown one before, I have no idea what's going on in here. Give me the controls. I'm going to be in control of this. That's essentially what he's doing.
Well, but
I
I
don't think he
sub
sees it that way.
but I submit to you that in this issue with evolution and atheism and everything, that's their issue. They're not willing to
Yeah.
submit their life to God in any way. They want to be God of their own life, and because basically in their minds, the fun will end and everybody will be miserable. Now, look, some people do have a distorted view of what Christianity is. They kind of see maybe a wacky church or some Christians doing some crazy stuff and they go, that's not me. Hey, I got news for you. I see Christians doing crazy stuff and I go, that's not me. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think oftentimes, um, maybe Jesus doesn't get represented very well, but hey, listen, you can work for a company that has a really bad employee, but that doesn't mean the whole company's bad. And
Right. I think, well,
there are some bad representatives of Christianity, but that doesn't mean Christianity is bad, you know?
no, it drives me crazy, some of these things. And it's so detrimental to Christianity when people would go into a supposed Christian church. And I would submit to anybody that might be watching this video that might be inclined to say, you know what, I'm going to go to church. I'm going to see what that's all about. If you go into a church and you see the people dancing with rattlesnakes and drinking strychnine, I would suggest to you that you leave.
I
That's
would leave.
not the place. That's not the place you want to be, and that's not a good representation of Christianity. We do not dance with rattlesnakes, and we don't suggest that anybody does that because they're poisonous snakes and they can cause you great harm. So look for a church that doesn't do that. Look for a church. Here's my suggestion: when you go into a church for the first time, if the pastor goes up there and he says, "Good morning, please open your Bibles to," that's the place you want to be. That's it. You
Yeah.
found a good church.
So we really didn't have, we didn't really get to life from non-life. Why don't we spend 5 minutes on that? So, because
Sure.
you had mentioned the origin of life, and I think that again, it's a non-starter. It's a showstopper for evolutionists and atheists that
Yeah.
you just you have to pretend. So basically, the foundation of their belief system is pretending. You have to pretend that science fiction and something out of a movie somehow is real. And imagine having a life based on a Hollywood movie. So that's science fiction. It's not even real for Hollywood. But you have to pretend that somehow things can come from nothing, which would be the origin of the universe, on their own, though they don't exist, they make themselves exist. And then after that happens, you have rocks. I don't know how. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Lawrence Krauss is supposed to be a smart guy. How on earth do atheists and evolutionists think that somehow stardust can create life? Wh- wh- how can that even be? That's no different than saying a rock can
Time.
create life. Time?
Yeah.
Time's a miracle
Yeah.
worker. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. It's
But it does,
interesting.
but
They say,
but it could be a gazillion years. You just can't get life.
well, right. Time is not an issue here. Time is more. It truly is. I'm not just saying this. Time is the enemy of the creation of life, because things are more inclined to become undone than to combine themselves in a way that would be conducive to life. And we've talked about this before. We talk about we look at the simplest life, a prokaryotic cell, and we can say that that's the simplest form of life that we know, but yet it's so complicated. There is so much to it. And not only does life have to form somehow, but even if it could, which it can't, it would have to be able to reproduce itself immediately. This can't be something that evolves over time. It has to come alive and be able to reproduce immediately. Or one generation is going to be dead. It's
Well, and you need a whole system.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, we get the problem with irreducible complexity. Um, I mean, it just goes on and on. The problems are endless, and we're just trying to form the life to evolve in the first place. Never
But
mind the
Herb, I don't mean
evolution.
to interrupt. I don't mean to interrupt you, but the reason that they're endless is because it's not true.
It's why going back to the origin of the universe again. Why do we have all these different theories and explanations? Because every one of them is ridiculous. They know that they're ridiculous. You mentioned Lawrence Krauss being a brilliant guy. He is a brilliant guy. And in fact, you can see his brilliance in some of the explanations that he comes up with. They're sheer nonsense. But man, the guy would be great in Hollywood, writing stories for movies and all. It's brilliant, some of the stuff he comes up with.
Brilliant fiction.
But it's just, but when you look at it, what's that?
Brilliant fiction.
Stephen Hawking was a brilliant guy, absolutely brilliant, no question about it. But the things when they come up with things and trying to explain the origins of the universe and how it came to be, their explanations are absolutely ridiculous. They're not based in any real science at all. They're conjecture. It's pure fantasy. There's nothing to back them up, and they fail on every level. But what it shows you is their rebellion and their desire to have nothing over them. They want no God over them, nothing to be beholden to, and you can see it. And it's not. We don't believe in God. We don't believe in this Creator because we're more intelligent than they are. It has nothing to do with intelligence. This is something that you either get on your knees and accept this, and not like you're submissive to God, yes, but it's a wonderful submission. It's a submission that if you know Him and you have a relationship with Him, you you don't want to get off of your knees. You're just you have this continual thanksgiving to Him for what He's done for you and continues to do for you. And if you don't accept that, if you just live your life in rejection, you don't know. You don't know what you're missing. What do the Psalms say? Come taste and see.
That the
If you
Lord is
taste,
good. Yeah.
if you taste Him, you cannot deny Him, and you want to be as close to Him as you can possibly be. And you look forward to the day that you can cast all this aside and just be with Him continually, where He's constantly with you. And I I don't know. I pray that every one of you will come to this knowledge, the knowledge that we as Christians have. And it's not because we're more intelligent or know more than anybody else. It's just a recognition that we've had in our lives, and we're so blessed by it, and we want that for you too.
Well,
So
I think Jesus said it best, right? Like he says everything best in John 7. He said, "He that's willing to do my will know the teaching, whether it be of God."
yeah,
It's a willingness. Are you willing to look at the evidence and to accept the conclusions of the evidence? One of the things I said to
yeah,
the kids today, Herb, was I said, the problem with assuming what you're trying to prove, in other words, begging the question, or in other words, having an end goal and trying to work the evidence to that, you're always going to go wrong. And I said, when we're dealing with, it's a different class, but, because we're dealing with apologetics, I said, when you're dealing with evidence, I said, a good detective looks at the evidence and says, okay, let's go step by step and see where this leads us. I said, but if you have a bias, and everybody has biases, but I said, if you have a biased detective and can't stand some guy and says, I don't care how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to pin this murder rap on that guy, right?
Yeah.
Then he'll just try to make all the evidence point to that person. And you know what? He'll be able to manipulate it and convince himself and others of it being that guy, though that guy may not have committed the murder, because you can
Yeah.
always you can always adjust the evidence to wherever you would like it to be, and you can force it into that mold. The question is, are you being honest with the evidence? And I think honestly that, especially when you get into these brilliant atheistic and evolutionary scientists, I don't think they're being honest with the evidence. I don't think that
No.
since the discovery of DNA, there should be any atheist on the planet. I mean, come on.
No. Yeah. It's
Let's be
absolutely ridiculous.
realistic about this.
Yeah. As you pointed out about the origins of life, and basically, they'd be much more sophisticated than this. But basically, what they're saying is you take a pile of something, some material, be it mud or whatever, clay. They like clay. We'll put clay and mud and some stones and sticks and whatever you want, any material that you want, choose it and put it into a warm pond somewhere and give it as much time as you want. If you want 1 billion years, take 1 billion years. If you want 2 trillion years, that's fine too. Um, whatever time you want, put it in there. Whatever atmospheric conditions you want, that's fine. You choose it, and you can have as much or as little oxygen as you want. You can choose all these things, and we'll leave for 2 trillion years, and we'll come back. And what are we going to find? Are we going to find life in there? I guarantee you that we will not find life in there. And whatever we put in there is going to be less ordered than what we started with 2 trillion years ago, and it's just going to be a mess. And yet they say that if you give it the time, that you're gonna have life come out of this, and and we're supposed to take this seriously. And this is how life originated. And if we don't accept that, we're just too stupid to see it. and
Well, I mean, really, you could make it into a very successful, probably go viral Saturday Night Live skit.
yeah, yeah. I, I'm sorry. I mean, I really am sorry, but it just becomes more and more ridiculous to me every time I approach the subject. And you 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 give them all. You take the most basic cell, and you give them all the material to go into it. Everything you need is right here. We'll give you the all the lab conditions you want, any conditions you want. And here's all the materials, and we're going to leave you alone to do what you want with it, and you're going to create life. They have no idea. They have all the materials right there. You can analyze any living organism. You can analyze it. And you know it's in there. Now, make life out of it. Make something alive. They haven't got a clue. They would be just sitting there looking at the stuff, scratching their heads. They have no idea,
Herb, J.
and
Vernon
yet they
McGee
claim
used
that
to,
they're always on the verge.
hey,
What's that?
J. Vernon McGee used to say, um, if you want to try to create life, go
Yeah,
into a mortuary where somebody has died, and you get all the pieces all put together. Just bring them back.
yeah. It's all right there,
You
isn't it?
don't even you don't have to hit the pond scum with electricity. You don't have to do any of that stuff. You get it. It's all put
Yeah,
together. All the cells are there. Just
yeah,
make life. Just make
yeah.
it go. They can't because nobody
See,
even knows what
this is
life
another
is.
thing. Yeah. Another thing, I've watched debates with different people. I've listened to lectures. I've read books from both sides of the issue. And, I'm a big fan of Arthur Wilder Smith, and he was big back in the 50s and 60s. And he wrote a lot of books on the origins of life and gave a lot of lectures on it, which you can watch on YouTube. They're great lectures that he gives. And he talks about these things, and he tries to be as honest. He is as honest as you can, because I can look I can look at secular sources too that confirm what he says is true, and he puts forward the information in a very honest, very sincere way. And I look at some of the origins of life researchers and I read their stuff, and quite frankly, they're dishonest. They don't have that the commitment to honesty that some of the creationists do have. And I I don't know. They can say what they want, and if they deceive people and they misrepresent things, fine. It does not make what they're saying true. If they convince a lot of people that what they're saying is true and that we're just on the verge of discovering life, which we have been since 1953, we've been right on the doorstep, and it's been going on that way ever since. But it doesn't make it any more real. So they're still in the same dilemma that they've always been in. And I don't know why they won't just come clean. Just why don't they just come out and say, we have no idea. We haven't got a clue. We're no closer now than we were 80 years ago. We just don't know how life could
Actually,
have come to
actually,
be.
because more is known about biology, they should say we're further away than we've ever been.
Well, that's the truth of it. Um, since the discovery of DNA and the complexity of DNA, that was a giant step backwards. But they try to make it out like this was a big advance for them. Like they've really gained somewhere. I know Darwin at the time of his book Origins of Species, 1859 it was. He thought of a cell being just a little glob of protoplasm. Nothing complicated at all. I honestly believe this. I think that if Darwin was alive today and could see the way that research has come along, I think he would throw his theory out, because it's far more complicated than he ever thought.
Well, you wouldn't even
And
have
we
to
just
get
keep
that
stepping.
far. Herb, you wouldn't have to get that far with him. He even said in Origin of the Species that
He did.
if
Yeah.
it could
Yeah.
be shown, which it has been at this point, that things, um, and he expected to find in the fossil record the fact that things had been discovered to have changed in, you know, many small modifications over time. He said, if you don't find that,
Yeah.
he said, which he expected to find, but they never did. He said, I
Yeah.
wouldn't even hold to my own theory. So you wouldn't even have to
Yeah.
get into the cell. He was willing to abandon his theory just based on the fossil record, which the fossil
Yeah.
record went in that direction. I mean, there's no transitional forms, and for any atheist or evolutionist that think there are, um, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge would beg to differ. And Gould died, what did he die, about 10 years ago, 15 years ago? He was the paleontologist right over here at Harvard. And,
Yeah.
their punctuated equilibrium paper from 1972 um,
Yeah.
tells you basically that there is no transitional forms, and that's why they believed, though their evidence was having no evidence, they believed that things punctuated and left no evidence, and the fossil record had changed so quickly. It, I mean,
Yeah. And
hey,
I find that
it's
interesting.
good. It's good if you can get it right.
Yeah, I find that interesting. The Gould and Eldridge, they recognize the fact that we don't have the transitional forms, and that this was a problem. And they flat out said, the two big evolutionists, they recognized the problem, they admitted the problem, and they thought, well, okay, something's got to be done about this. Well, as a side, today we have evolution. Oh, we have plenty of transitional forms. Well, the fact of the matter is they do not. They don't have them.
Must
And
have got them in the
well,
last
anyway,
dozen years, right? since they
Yeah,
must have found them all in the last dozen years since Gould died.
yeah. And then you got, okay, so they had to come around with a solution for this. So they came up with punctuated equilibrium. And they say, well, yeah, evolution can be a slow and gradual process, which it normally is, but there are times it can accelerate, and we have faster periods of growth, and that explains the Cambrian period and all these life forms coming at a very rapid rate at one time. This was a punctuated equilibrium. But you may know or not know, but this has a whole bunch of problems in itself. Allopatric speciation for one thing, and that would say, well, we have a problem in that if there's a mutation, we could get into that, and that's a huge problem, these mutations. But if there's a mutation that adds information to the genome, which we have no evidence of at all, but if there was, to get through a large population would take an immense amount of time. So that would, the Cambrian explosion would not be justifiable with that rate of mutation and getting it through an entire genome in a population. Now we can say allopatric speciation. They say, okay, part of that population was isolated on a little island somewhere away from the other ones. So if we had the mutation, now that can go through the population much more quickly because it's just a small population isolated from the others. Well, now you got the problem is with the mutation rate, it's the same thing, but a different problem. You're not having the mutations. So you can have a large population, more likely to have a mutation, but much slower to spread around. Or you can have allopatric speciation, smaller population, but now you don't have the mutations. So either
Yeah,
way,
because you don't have the large enough population. Yeah.
right, right. So either way, you get a problem wherever you go here.
Well,
And I just find,
hey, I find it interesting that Gould and Eldritch, being as smart as they were, top of their field, well respected and everything, instead of saying, it just Darwin was right, and we shouldn't continue to follow, you know, his model. They doubled down and they said, they
yeah,
did. They said, we're going to get that guy for murder, no matter how we get him, and even though the evidence doesn't point to him, we'll make it point to him. That's what they
right,
basically did. They
yeah,
were bad detectives, and they decided we're going to make sure that that we get this guy for murder because we just don't like him. And they didn't like creationists, and they weren't gonna go in that
right.
direction. Basically, come hell or high water, they were not gonna do it, and they were gonna find a way around it. So they basically come up with a ridiculous
They're
paper.
gonna make stuff up.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
is a story.
It's
You
almost as
know.
if like you wanted to get a guy, you wanted to get a guy and you accuse him of Russian collusion. So you made up all these stories and
Oh,
planted
nobody,
evidence and all.
nobody would go to that extent. Come on.
It's just I know that this would never happen in reality, but I'm just using it as a illustration. What could happen in some
Well, I
fantasy
mean,
land.
if you were going to do that, then you'd have to create a dossier. You'd have to then
Yeah,
give it to
yeah,
like find maybe a spy or something and
yeah,
have
yeah.
them lie about it. Come on, you, what are you, a
No,
conspiracy
yeah,
theorist?
no, nobody's gonna do that. Nobody's gonna
Nobody,
do
you couldn't make a Hollywood movie out of that because it's
that.
not that people would walk out saying this isn't even plausible. Uh,
Maybe 20
you
years
know,
from now, things calm down, it will be a movie.
you know, I grew up on the Three Stooges. And
Yeah.
one time, um, when Mo, Larry, and Curly were before the judge, Curly said something that was ridiculous. And the judge looked at him and he said, "The truth is stranger than fiction, Judgy Wudgy." Maybe
Yeah.
maybe we'll end with that. So
Yeah.
listen,
All right. All right.
If you've stayed with us this long, I apologize. We went a little over an hour, and but we um, we kind of talked through a lot of these things. We could go on and on. There's certainly a ton of information that just there's a landslide of information and evidence against evolution and atheism, certainly. But at this point, we would recommend that you, if you're a Christian, get into the Bible, make sure that you know what you believe and why you believe it. And if you're not a Christian, then we would recommend that you get into the Bible and see what it says before you criticize it. So until next week, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.